Hey everyone, I'm Dark Skeleton, and this is my Ancestor's Call Shaman deck. If you haven't already seen my last video about Ancestor's Call, it is a new card that was just announced for Hearthstone in the Goblins vs. Gnomes expansion set. Ancestor's Call, for 4 mana, as a shaman, you can put a random minion from each player's hand into the battlefield. Effectively, it is a spell version of Alarmabot, but much more reliable. In order for Ancestor's Call to actually work, we need to have some high-end minions in the deck, which is a different kind of approach to Shaman, because normally Shaman doesn't have a lot of high-end minions. In this deck, however, we're running Sylvanas Windrunner, Alakir the Windlord, Kel'thuzad, and Sneed's Old Shredder. The Ancestor's Call serves as a low-mana way of getting those cards out, and then the deck revolves around abusing the fact you got them out for cheap. I'll be discussing the card choice within the deck, with more focus on the unusual cards in a Shaman deck, and then we'll go into the strategy of how this deck is intended to work. Keep in mind that this is all untested theory, and how well the deck will actually hold up in Goblins vs. Gnomes is yet to be seen. We'll be going top to bottom for the card discussion, so to start things off we have Earthshock ×1. Normally Shaman decks run 2, as Shaman is a deck that normally uses answers from their hand to eliminate their opponent's threats. However, the Shaman deck makes up for the lack of direct removal with mid-game and late-game minions. The thing about Earthshock is that although it has some great targets like a Twilight Drake, not every card is equally affected by Earthshock, and it's a situational card. Because the deck has enough huge minions on its own, I thought that it could stand to have a little bit less removal. Of course, the deck still runs 2 Hexes and 2 Lightning Storms, so you still have some answers to different situations. The deck also runs 1 Rockbiter weapon, and the main target for that is Alakir the Windlord. The main reason there's 1 and not 2 is because the deck has no Doomhammer. If you can't save it for Alakir, you can always use it as a cheap 1-mana removal spell. Next up we have Double Flame Tongue Totem. Although the average mana curve of the deck is towards the later side of things, there are still some early game minions that work very well with Flame Tongue Totem. And, of course, you always have totems. Flame Tongue Totem is great at making effective trades, and I think even in a late game Shaman deck like this one, it still belongs. Speaking of minions that work well with Flame Tongue Totem, we have the Haunted Creeper ×2. The reason for having this in the deck is that it's a very sticky minion that often gets you multiple minions, as it hits its Deathrattle effect and creates 2 new 1/1s. The more minions you have, the better Flame Tongue Totem is, and it's very hard to clear off the board. Being able to maintain board control is pretty important, so Haunted Creeper with Flame Tongue Totem is pretty good. Next we have Reincarnate ×2. If you know about Kalinto's recent legendary Shaman deck where he runs 1 Reincarnate, you know that it can be a pretty good card, but 2 is usually out of the question. The reason that I think Reincarnate ×2 works here is that this deck has a lot of higher end minions that work really well with Reincarnate. Among these include Piloted Shredder, Piloted Sky Golem, Sylvanas Windrunner, Alakir the Windlord, Kel'thuzad, and even Sneed's Old Shredder. If you're able to sneak any of those out to the field with Ancestor's Call and still have mana left over, then Reincarnate has the potential to get you some absolutely ridiculous value. It's situational, it requires setup, but it has the potential to be very good. And there are plenty of targets in the deck for it. Now we have 2 Deathlords in the deck, and by this point you're probably thinking, hey Dark Skeleton, what the heck are you doing? You're not running Feral Spirit, you're running 2 Deathlords? And at first glance, yes, that does seem like a subpar play. But the main problem with running Feral Spirit is the 2-mana overload. I believe that turns 4 through 7 are just too important in this deck for you to be able to play Feral Spirit and mess up your mana curve. And the deck doesn't have enough overload cards to make Unbound Elemental worth playing. The reason behind Deathlords is that since this deck has so much late game, its early game is weaker. Without these Deathlords, I think it would be too easy for a Zoo or a Hunter deck to walk over you. Now, of course, Deathlord on its own has very strong stats. The drawback is that it will summon a free minion for your opponent. That has the potential to utterly screw you over, but since this is a late game Shaman deck, more likely than not, those cards are going to come out sooner or later, including things like Ysera. The deck does run 2 Hexes, so hopefully if worst comes to worst, you can at least hex whatever comes out. In healthier situations, it will at least force a lot of removal out of your opponent, or can wall your opponent's minions very hard. The main purpose for it here is to bring you into the mid and late game so that you can actually get rolling and make this deck do what it's designed to do. So as I've mentioned a couple times, the deck runs 2 Hexes, there's nothing special about that. Every Shaman deck, more or less, is going to run 2 Hexes. And this is just simply because it's some of the best, if not the best, removal in the game. Against any mid or late game deck, there's going to be huge targets you have to get rid of immediately, like a Tyrian Forgery. If you can't at all do it, you have to save hexes for those big targets. But keep in mind, with this deck, you have a lot of big targets that your opponent also has to save their removal for. I'd even say enough that they don't have enough removal to take care of all of it, so eventually something will land on them and they'll just be devastated. Moving on from Hex, we have the Lightning Storm ×2. This is the Shaman's AoE ability. It's a very, very good spell, especially if you can get a Wrath of Bear totem onto the field. If your opponent starts to overwhelm you, that's when you want a Lightning Storm. Not too much else to say about it, it's just a very solid board clear. We've also got one Manatide Totem in the deck, and I was really considering not running Manatide Totem. The reason for that is that as a card, it doesn't put any pressure on your opponent immediately. However, if it does remain on the field, you can get a sick amount of card draw, and if your opponent is forced to remove it directly, because you have something like a Death Lord blocking it, then that means you gain card advantage. It might be better to hold on to it until the late game though. Since we've already talked about Ancestor's Call as a card, we'll wait until the strategy section to bring it up again. Next up we have Cultmaster ×2, which can get you a lot of card draw if you're willing to trade your field off. In this deck you have a ton of minions with lots of very, very powerful Deathrattle effects. So that means you're not scared of making direct trades with your opponent's minions at all. And plus, hero power totems were free to begin with. If you can plop down a Flame Tongue totem on a field that you already have control over, and then throw down a Cultmaster, you should be able to be pretty happy drawing 2 or 3 cards. Cultmaster is in here instead of Azure Drake because I felt that that 1 extra mana for Azure Drake kind of makes it a little bit too slow to play. And also there aren't many spell damage cards in the deck for Azure Drake's spell damage to benefit from anyway. Now we can get into another one of the Goblins vs. Gnomes cards. We have the Piloted Shredder. It's a card I believe is going to be very, very popular in the new set. It's a 4/3 minion for 4, it's also a mech, and what it does as a Deathrattle is to summon a random 2-cost minion to the field. It's a lot like a Harvest Golem Plus. You could use Reincarnate on it, but it would be one of the weakest cards in the deck as a target for that. Still, everybody knows that Harvest Golem is a great value card, and Piloted Shredder also fills that role. It has slightly higher stats and a stronger Deathrattle effect for 1 more mana. Next, like a lot of decks are running right now, we have Loatheb in the deck. This prevents your opponent's spells from absolutely annihilating your board, or, even worse, killing some of your big guys like a Sneed's Old Shredder or a Kel'thuzad. Loatheb is powerful at anti-control, and I think it's solid in this deck as it is solid in many other decks. Because this deck is so late game, it needs to be able to survive the early game, so that's why I put 2 Sludge Belchers into it. Sludge Belcher is good at keeping you alive a couple extra turns, and good at killing weak minions. I'm sure everybody basically already knows that, but Sludge Belcher is in the deck as a defensive card to make sure you can at least last long enough to play your late game in the first place. We have only 1 Fire Elemental in the deck, and that's kind of crazy for Shamans, because normally Fire Elemental is a great card. The problem is, it's kind of a liability when you're trying to play Ancestor's Call. You don't want to Ancestor's Call a Fire Elemental out, and if you end up getting 2 in your hand, then that can really cause some complications. It's still an amazing minion, and waiting a little bit longer to play Ancestor's Call to play 1 Fire Elemental is not that big of a deal, because Fire Elemental is still a great turn 6 play. However, with Goblins vs. Gnomes, we also have Piloted Sky Golem ×2. The trade-off here is that you're getting more synergy with the Reincarnate to be able to summon 4-cost minions to the field, plus the Deathrattle effect on its own is slightly stronger than deal 3 damage. Up against the Fire Elemental's ability to regain board control immediately. It's a tough call, but I actually think the 2 cards are comparable, and Piloted Sky Golem works a little bit better in this deck in general. Though I certainly wouldn't blame you for running 2 Fire Elementals instead. Now we can get into the 4 big legendaries in the deck. First up, we have Sylvanas Windrunner, which is so cheesy in a Reincarnate deck that it should almost be banned. Whether you play Ancestor's Call, or you play Sylvanas just as a 6-drop, you can immediately Reincarnate her for 2 mana to steal a random enemy minion. And then on top of that, still have a Sylvanas on the field, which will steal another enemy minion. Doing it with Ancestor's Call means your opponent will definitely have something on your board, because remember, Ancestor's Call summons something for your opponent as well, and you get to cheat Sylvanas out 2 mana earlier. So an immediate turn 6 Reincarnate Sylvanas play is definitely possible. As many current Shaman decks are running, this one also runs Alakir the Windlord. It's a card that can serve as a quick burst, or the ability to remove a couple minions and maybe even still exist on the field. This deck still runs 2 Flame Tongue totems and Rockbiter weapons, so you can still use him as an endgame finisher. However, I think more than likely you'll use him as good minion removal. One trick you can do with him is to Reincarnate him after you've already used his charge ability to use him again in the same turn. Next we have Kel'thuzad, who might be the ultimate Reincarnate cheese. If you're able to sneak him out on turn 6 using Ancestor's Call, you can also use Reincarnate on him to have Kel'thuzad resummon Kel'thuzad to the field, giving you 2 Kel'thuzads. Kel'thuzad already works pretty well in the deck because it has a lot of powerful death rattles like a piloted Sky Golem does. Being able to resummon a piloted Sky Golem that's going to summon you another 4-cost minion to the field is actually kinda absurd. If your opponent can't remove your Kel'thuzad and they can't finish you off right then and there, then you probably win the game. Lastly, we have Sneed's Old Shredder, who might be the ultimate card in death rattle effects. When this guy dies, you summon a random legendary to the field. It's an absurdly good target for Reincarnate, and also great if you play Sneed's and then play Kel'thuzad on top of him. Alright, so now for the general strategy of the deck. As you pull out your opening hand, you want to aggressively mill to try to get a Haunted Creeper or a Death Lord. You want to have something to play early game. If you need an Earth Shock because you think you're going up against a handlock, or you are unconfident about your ability to survive the early to mid game, you can also keep a Rockbiter weapon or an Earth Shock. Early on, you're probably going to be making a lot of totems, so you'll be playing catch up from behind. If you can make any pretty decent trades with Flame Tongue Totem, then you don't need to be worried about using them up. It's not that huge of a deal. Ideally, you can get your Death Lord out on turn 3 and keep it around. If you're able to get to turn 4 without falling too far behind, you should be in pretty good shape. If your field still has a couple minions on it, you can use Cult Master or Flame Tongue Totem to regain board control or gain better card advantage. Though more than likely the optimal play on turn 4 would be to play Piloted Shredder, as it's a minion that's going to stay on the field and has quite a bit of attack damage anyway. If you're going up against an aggressive deck, then on turn 5 Sludge Belcher can slow them down. However, if you're going up against a controlling deck that's about to AoE your entire board, then Loatheb might be a better play. On turn 6 things start to get a little bit ridiculous. You can play a Piloted Sky Golem or a Fire Elemental, both of which are very, very strong minions. If your hand is composed of Alakir, Kel'Thuzad, Sneed's Old Shredder, and an Ancestor's Call, then you can use Ancestor's Call to cheat one of them out instead. On the back of that, you'd want to attack with Alakir and get a couple minions, then reincarnate it to summon a new one, or to immediately reincarnate a Kel'Thuzad to have 2 Kel'Thuzads on the field, or reincarnate a Sneed's Old Shredder to summon another random legendary to the field and to rebirth Sneed's Old Shredder. On the back of any of those turn 6 plays, your opponent is likely to burn some of its removal. Still continue following it up with other big minions like Fire Elemental, Piloted Sky Golem, Sylvanas Windrunner, or Alakir, Kel'Thuzad, Sneed's Old Shredder on turn 8. Somewhere along the lines, your opponent's going to play their trump card. If you still have Sylvanas in your hand and at least one reincarnate, you can play Sylvanas, reincarnate her to steal your opponent's big legendary, Tyrion, and then still have a fresh new Sylvanas on the field. As you go into turns 8, 9, and 10, you have 3 huge legendaries to play against your opponent, Alakir, Kel'Thuzad, and Sneed's Old Shredder. You should generally abuse their unique effects to gain massive board control over your opponent. If things still go to the late game and you still have board control, then you are in the ideal scenario. The minions that this deck runs, including Piloted Shredder, Piloted Sky Golem, and Sneed's Old Shredder, have ridiculously powerful death rattle effects. When you trade into your opponent's minions, get a 1-for-1 trade, and then summon a fresh new guy to the field, you are going to have so many creatures over your opponent that they will die eventually. If you ever have the opportunity to play Kel'Thuzad on a field you have board control over, and you can trade minions that same turn, then you should definitely play Kel'Thuzad, as that will get you a lot of new minions back to your field, and the death rattles are likely to get you more minions on top of that. Most classes don't have anywhere near enough removal to really take care of that, except for maybe Paladins. As long as you have board control, you should be able to play your card draw cards effectively. If you have minions to trade on the field to your opponent's minions, then Cult Master becomes a great option for drawing cards. But if you're just sitting back and waiting for your opponent to respond to what you already have on the board, then maybe you can play a Manatide Totem instead. Ideally, the Death Rattle and Reincarnate effects of this deck will be able to bring you into a late game victory. Just keep in mind that this deck is a minion board control deck, and you're not really in any hurry to rush your opponent down. It wouldn't even surprise me if a lot of opponents just surrender when they see Kel'Thuzad come out, because they already know there's nothing they can do to stop you. I hope if you decide to try it that it works out for you pretty well, or at least that this video gave you some ideas of what you can do with the new expansion. If you have any feedback, comments, or questions, then go ahead and leave it down below. If you want to see more Hearthstone or Goblins vs. Gnomes content, then go ahead and subscribe. And I've been Dark Skeleton. Thank you all for watching.